From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. J.D. Vance criticizes America's allies in Europe as the vice president opens talks with Ukrainian President Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. We're joined ahead by former Defense Secretary, former CIA Director Leon Panetta on chances for a ceasefire. President Trump threatens reciprocal tariffs on trade partners and now adds auto tariffs today. We explore the potential economic impact with Nazak Nikakhtar, former Undersecretary for the Department of Commerce. And Republicans clear a budget resolution with at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts as Elon Musk calls for entire federal agencies to be deleted. We'll have analysis ahead from our political panel. Thanks for being with us on the late edition of Balance of Power. You made it to Friday, and we start in Munich, Germany, where today Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a speech criticizing some of America's closest allies.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
The vice president did not mention the war in Ukraine in that speech, but he did meet with Ukraine's president, as we mentioned, Volodymyr Zelensky, after threatening Russia with sanctions and even military action in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. This, of course, comes at a critical moment for the war, after President Trump said he plans to mediate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Here's the president earlier in the Oval Office.
Who do you blame for the war, Ukraine or Russia?
Well, I think that there were a lot of people to blame. All I can say is very simply, if I were president, that war would never have happened.
Joining us now, Leon Panetta, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense under the Obama administration. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm trying to track the messaging here from the administration because J.D. Vance's remarks today suggesting that U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine still on the table conflict with what we heard yesterday from the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who made clear that the pre-2014 lines that were drawn in Ukraine were unrealistic to achieve in a peace deal, that Ukraine would be unrealistic to consider itself part of NATO. Is the chaos here, the confusion in the messaging, a strategy?
It doesn't strike me as a strategy. It strikes me as a lot of mixed signals based on a new administration that really has not come together to make sure that everybody would be on the same message with regards to national security. And so everybody who comes in has a different view, says something different, and very frankly, it's just not very clear right now just exactly where the United States stands.
We heard again from the Secretary of Defense yesterday, who did clean up some of those remarks, by the way. The reaction was pretty intense on both fronts, and I'd like to go through both of them with you. Let's start with Hegseth. The chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Roger Wicker, responding in a conversation with Politico, said he was puzzled and disturbed by the remarks. He said that he don't know who wrote the speech, but it was a rookie mistake in Brussels, the kind of thing Tucker Carlson would have written, and Carlson is a fool. That's a direct quote from the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. How are things starting out for this new defense secretary?
Well, when you get those kinds of remarks from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, it should be a wake-up call with regards to what you decide to say and where you decide to say it. Look, this country has spent an awful lot since World War II. First of all, we fought World War II with our allies to make sure that extremism would never prevail. And we worked together with our allies since World War II to make sure that that Russia and Putin would never succeed. And those are somehow those are the real founding principles that guide us in terms of our national security. And when people are now saying things that create some confusion as to whether the United States still represents a strong leadership position, working with our allies to make sure that we protect freedom in Europe, I think that's cause for concern. So I really do think that the administration has to get its act together better.
Well, I want to fast forward then to today, J.D. Vance, and the messaging that we heard as he opened talks, if we can call it that, with the president of Ukraine. He did sit down behind closed doors with Volodymyr Zelensky, and there are great questions about Vladimir Putin's motivations here as we talk the idea of peace. I spoke earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio with Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council and what she had to say about how Putin views this war.
He thinks he's winning. He's still taking territory. It's slow going, but he has momentum, particularly in the Donbass, and there's no reason for him to jump ship. He wants to destroy Ukraine, Joe. That's his goal, and he's doing it slowly but surely. And he's betting that he cares more about Ukraine than the United States or Europe does.
Do you agree with Melinda Herring on that, Secretary, that Vladimir Putin would simply use a ceasefire to regroup?
Well, I think there's real concern about what Putin would do during a ceasefire and whether or not he really is credible and trustworthy with regards to negotiations for peace. Look, Putin is the aggressor here. Putin invaded an independent, sovereign country, Ukraine. And he has not been successful because the United States and our allies in NATO have supported Ukraine in this war. I think it is very important for the United States to make clear that Putin will not succeed in taking over Ukraine, period. That has to be a clear, fundamental statement that Putin will not succeed. And it's an important message to send not just to Putin, it's a message that we need to send to Xi in China. We need to send it to Iran. We need to send it to North Korea, that we will not allow a tyrant to take over a sovereign and independent country. So I really hope that, in terms of any of these negotiations we're talking about, that there is one fundamental principle the United States will not put on the table, and that's that we will do everything necessary to protect an independent and sovereign Ukraine, period. That is a principle the United States cannot give up on.
Yeah. Well, this administration is watching a couple of hot spots right now, and I'm very curious to hear what you think is going to happen tomorrow at noontime, Saturday, in Gaza, as we expect here the release of at least 3 hostages. President Trump has said if the hostages are not released on time, all hell will break out. What do you expect will take place tomorrow? Benjamin Netanyahu is also threatening intense fighting.
Well, there have been a lot of concerns, but Hamas seems to indicate that they will, in fact, release these hostages. I hope that is the case, and that we're able to continue the ceasefire that was put in place. But like everything else, it's really dependent on Hamas and whether Hamas is willing to stick to the terms of the agreement that was arrived at. Look, we've been able to achieve a ceasefire. The hope is that we can continue to work towards a more permanent peace, and that Israel and Hamas and other countries don't have to go back to war. We're looking for a more permanent peace. I hope the administration focuses on the Abraham Accords and really tries to work with moderate Arab countries in the effort to try to produce that more permanent resolution of peace in the Middle East.
I'm afraid we're out of time, sir, but I am curious if we could do a yes or no here. Do you believe that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to reach phase 2 in the ceasefire?
I think if he doesn't want to achieve phase 2, that there will come a moment where he will no longer be head of Israel. His responsibility to Israel is not only to obviously defeat Hamas, but it's to achieve a permanent peace. And that's how he'll be judged as to whether or not he was able to do that.
The take from Leon Panetta. It's great to have you back, sir. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense, former CIA Director. Great to have you with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, House Republicans clear a budget resolution after 12 hours of debate in committee. Now comes the hard part. We'll take a closer look next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We didn't get here as a country in just a few months. This is decades and decades of mismanagement and overspending. And so it's going to take us, a couple of years to get this fixed. But we're ready to hit the ground running. And that's why this bill is so aggressive in this respect, because we know this is an amazing opportunity to finally get the House in order.
Republican Congressman Tim Moore of North Carolina talking with us yesterday here on Balance of Power on the House budget resolution that actually passed committee last night. There were a lot of questions going into this. Debate lasted for 12 hours. And joining us now is Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government with her eyes on Capitol Hill. Kate, it's great to see you. Some folks didn't think it would even get out of committee, so this is progress. What does it tell us about the road ahead?
Well, like you said, the hard part comes now.
Yeah.
It has to pass on the floor, and we see also how House Republicans and Senate Republicans are going on different tracks. They've got the one big, beautiful bill that they call it going on the House side that made it out of the committee the other night. And then they've got this two-bill sort of, that they were trying to do a two-bill plan in the Senate.
Senate side.
So it's a lot still up in the air, and separately, the government could shut down in less than a month.
Well, true enough.
So there's a lot to happen in the next
in a very short period of time here. When you look at some of the numbers, at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts to get to $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. There's a bit of a seesaw here, right? If they find more spending, they can cut taxes by more. This is going to be the heart of the argument for Republicans.
Right, and you're seeing, because all of these spending cuts, somebody's invested in that money.
Sure.
So you've got people coming to Washington now saying, don't cut my program. And meanwhile, on the executive branch side, there's the DOGE effort cutting things. So there's just a lot of defensive posturing that we're seeing from the business community, the nonprofit world. Lobbyists are really out in force trying to protect some of those programs while also looking for opportunities in the tax, potential tax cuts or tax credits. And then you've got on the, the other side, nonprofit organizations and people who represent government workers trying to, stem some of the losses.
And Republicans plan to do all of this on their own through reconciliation. They can't lose basically a single vote, at least in the House.
Right. On the reconciliation stuff and the tax cuts.
How are they going to get this
When
done?
you're looking at the funding of the government, though, they're probably going to need Democrats to move that. So you'll have to see, will there be any bipartisan, working together to solve that issue? It's a very acrimonious time on Capitol Hill.
Life's not getting easier for Mike Johnson, clearly. Kate Ackley, Bloomberg Government, thank you so much for the update. We'll have more as House lawmakers return to town. Meantime, Justice Department officials in both New York City and Washington, D.C. today resigning instead of carrying out an order to drop the corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Among them, Hagan Scotton, the lead prosecutor in the case, who said only a fool or a coward would dismiss the charges, as the DOJ ordered here. Mayor Adams responding to critics this morning on Fox and Friends.
I don't get into the legalese. I have an attorney to do that, and I pay a lot for that. What we need to be clear on, if the mayor of the city of New York is unable to collaborate, deal with intelligence information, sit down with my state and federal agencies and sit down to coordinate for public safety, we're still under the terrorist threat. We still have illegal gangs in our community that's bringing about destruction that ICE is attempting to weed out. If I can't coordinate that, that's a public safety issue.
Those of you with us on Bloomberg TV or YouTube see Tim Homan, President Trump's borders are sitting next to him. With us now, live from New York for a closer look, Bloomberg's Ava Benny-Morrison. Ava, thanks for joining. The resignations aside, is this case as good as over?
Well, Eric Adams would like to think so, but officially the charges have not been dropped. There has been a bit of a scramble within the DOJ over the past 24 hours to try and find a prosecutor who is willing to put their name to a motion that would ask the judge to formally withdraw these charges. It has truly been a remarkable week within the Justice Department. Over the past 30 hours or so, we've seen the resignation of several prosecutors over how this case and the intervention from some top leadership at the Justice Department in the Eric Adams case has been handled.
He said he's never offered any trade of authority for an end to the case. How's this playing in Manhattan?
It's been quite controversial, as I'm sure you can imagine. In one of the strongly worded letters from the top prosecutor in Manhattan, Danielle Sassoon, who resigned yesterday, she suggested that Eric Adams' lawyers put forward what amounted to a quid pro quo agreement, in that he would help Trump's immigration enforcement priorities, but he could only do that if the indictment was dropped. Now, he has strongly rejected that claim, but we heard from Governor Kathy Hochul earlier today, who said the allegations are very serious and she needs some time to consider it.
Well, what can the governor do in this case?
There have been calls for her to step in and dismiss him from his role. She's definitely stopped short of doing that, but there are some growing calls today for her to step in and take some action here.
Next steps then in this case, Ava, what happens come next week?
We're waiting over the next few hours, actually, to see if there is that motion filed in court that will get the ball rolling on the withdrawal process. Of course, it'll be up to a federal judge to decide whether the prosecutors can actually withdraw the charges. So I don't think that this saga is over yet.
All right. Bloomberg's Ava Benny-Morrison, thank you so much for the great reporting from New York. Coming up on Balance of Power, my conversation with George Callas, the executive vice president at Arnold Ventures, a deep dive into the implications of extending certain tax cuts. He's out with new legislation, or research, I should say, that finds a way to pay for them. We'll get into the sausage making next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining. Republicans on the House Budget Committee, as we've been reporting, cleared a resolution late last night that gets the gears turning on a reconciliation bill that Speaker Johnson wants to include inside an extension of the Trump-era tax cuts. The problem is how to pay for them. Today on the early edition of Balance of Power, I spoke with George Callas, Executive Vice President, Public Finance at Arnold Ventures, which produced a new report on wasteful spending and how to extend the cuts without adding to the deficit. It includes 10 spending cuts, 10 loopholes to be closed, including repealing EV tax credits. Listen.
Of the IRA green energy package that the Democrats enacted in 2022, the EV subsidies have like the least bang for the buck. They cost the most relative to the climate impact they have. And so if there's any low-hanging fruit in the green energy space, I think it's the electric vehicle area.
All right, so we're flying along, pretty smooth flight so far. We're about to hit massive turbulence. Ready? Apply the SALT cap to businesses. Brace yourself. $823 billion. I thought we were going to raise the cap on SALT for individuals. I'm assuming you don't want to see that happen and you want to add it to business. Is that right?
Well, right. So there's currently a $10,000 cap on the SALT deduction. Yep. If you simply extend everything, it stays there. I think from a policy perspective, the ideal SALT cap is $0.
Someone's screaming right now in New York. I can hear it.
Well, I like to say I would double that amount for married couples,
Okay.
double the zero.
Mike Lawler's calling. He wants to talk.
I suspect, yes. I suspect I'll have a note from his office when I get back later this afternoon. But, the policy rationale is that if somebody's in the 37% federal tax bracket and their state raises their taxes by $100, if there's an unlimited SALT deduction, it only costs them $67 or $63.
So they just keep hiking property.
And the other $37 is basically paid for by the rest of the country. And so, that rationale applies to both individual taxes and to business taxes. Now, I would say the revenue from extending it to business taxes is pretty substantial. And there are a lot of good pro-growth business and corporate tax relief provisions on the table as well, provisions that I think we would say are good policy. And so maybe the corporate SALT deduction revenues should be, allocated mostly to those provisions, whether Trump wants to reduce the corporate rate further, depreciation, R&D, things like that.
My terminal is exploding right now on this. All right, if I had time to mention one more, this loophole, this is right down the middle for the Bloomberg audience. Reduce tax preference for stock buybacks over dividends. A lot of people watching and listening right now are going to bristle at this idea. Why would it work?
So that's a good example of another principle we have with a lot of these proposals, which is we're not trying to punish people. We're trying to find areas where there's non-neutrality, where there's economic distortions, and move closer to economic neutrality, because in the long run that leads to more economic efficiency, more economic growth, a stronger economy. There is a tax distortion that from a tax perspective, using stock buybacks to return cash to shareholders is favored from a tax perspective compared to just paying out dividends.
That's why they just keep buying stock. You can find my full conversation with George Callas. We learned a lot today from Arnold Ventures online or on the terminal. A lot more ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I'd say over the next sometime, or maybe around April 2nd. I would have done them on April 1st. Believe it or not, I'm a little superstitious. No, literally, we had it planned for April 1st. I said, let's make it April 2nd. You know how much money that costs? That costs a lot of money just that one day.
Yes, auto tariffs are coming April 2nd, not on April Fool's Day. President Trump making the announcement a short time ago in the Oval Office as he was signing some executive actions. Now, those tariffs are expected to impact vehicles imported into the U.S., of course, make up half the American auto market. And that's just where we start with Nazak Nikakhtar, former Undersecretary for the Department of Commerce. It's great to have you back. Do you think these auto tariffs are actually implemented on the 2nd of April?
Absolutely. I think we're either going to come right to the brink of it and there's going to be a great deal struck, or the tariffs will be implemented. The imbalance in the auto trade has been a huge irritant to the Trump administration with the imbalances in tariffs. You've got countries with their standards that preclude the exports of autos, right? You've got Japan and South Korea there. And you've got Europe with 10% tariffs on passenger vehicles when ours is 2.5, and European standards that keep not only cars out of the European market, but cars out of the countries with which Europe has trade agreements. And Europe has blocked out U.S. cars, but it's opened its arms to Chinese EVs. Absolutely. The Trump administration is having a huge problem with this. They looked at the autos industry. In the first administration, it's unfinished business. They're very serious about progressing.
Okay, well, that would be a headline because, Nazak, we've heard about a lot of different tariffs over the past couple of weeks. Yesterday, it was reciprocal tariffs. We're going to wait on that for a couple of weeks while a review is conducted. Unclear how that ends. 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico put on hold following certain concessions. Another review is underway there. I guess there's a question about how much intent there is to implement these tariffs versus using them as a bargaining chip to exact concessions from trading partners.
That's a really great way of thinking about it. And ultimately, they converge, right?
Do they?
is saying, look, I've got issues. I've got issues in our trading relationship. You are harming U.S. interests. You're undermining U.S. manufacturing and jobs because you're acting unfairly. So either you remove these unfair trade practices or I'm imposing tariffs. So the negotiation leads to either solving the problems or the tariffs are there to offset the adverse economic impact that the problems have caused.
Sure. But, we're talking about this in a vacuum. When you add the idea of helping to subsidize the Trump tax cuts, these were supposed to be revenue generators. If the negotiating is so successful, there are no tariffs, how do you pay for the rest of the program?
Well, I think that's true. And I think the president is betting that not every country is going to resolve to negotiate their way out of these tariffs. Some of these countries are adamant about protecting their industries. So to the extent they can't, and we can't get reciprocal trade or we can't get some of these distortions resolved, absolutely he's going to impose tariffs. And the president is smart. He did this during the first administration. Secretary Bessent, very, very smart. They're going to, as before, calibrate the tariff revenue against the tax cuts. They're going to be pursuing tax cuts, but how aggressive those are going to be is going to be based on the tariff revenue generated.
Yeah. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, we've got a live view of President Trump coming down the stairs off of Air Force One to get into the beast. He has made his way home, if we can call Palm Beach home. He is going to be spending the weekend in Florida and now getting back to life at Mar-a-Lago. This is a live view of the president, who apparently is in no mood to be answering questions from reporters today. That looks like the end of the business week, but we'll, of course, keep tabs on him while he is down there. Donald Trump back in Florida after another whirlwind week. Of course, it was only hours ago he was sitting in the Oval Office talking about this very issue that we're discussing right here on Bloomberg. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, incoming Commerce Secretary, was there as well in the Oval Office, talking about the administration's plan for implementing these new reciprocal tariffs that I referred to. Here's how he put it.
We are going to address each country one by one. But here's the key. They'll get an invitation to trade with the greatest consumer economy in the world. And in exchange for trading at the greatest consumer economy in the world, you have to treat us the way we're going to treat you. It's going to be the same, but no more inviting bad people to the party.
Okay, Nazak, so talk to me about the economic impact here. Donald Trump talked about the potential for some temporary pain. Are we going to feel it?
He may, depending on how extensive those tariffs are. In the first administration, his tariffs were calibrated against tax cuts, right? And much of the Chinese, the impact of the tariffs, the Chinese didn't pass through. They lowered their prices so the importers wouldn't have to bear the brunt of the tariffs. I think the calculus is different right now. If he's going after every single country, right? Not everybody's China, not everybody's going to absorb the tariff burden. Some are going to pass it through. The administration is going to try to work with Congress to see how aggressive they can get on tax cuts, what else they can do to offset some of the pain. But will there be a transition time to maybe recalibrate our trading relationships, important trading relationships with partners? Absolutely. Is that necessary? Absolutely. The status quo can't continue the way it is. We are losing jobs. We're losing vital industries that are important to national and economic security.
It reminds me of a conversation we had here on Bloomberg with David Kelly, who's the chief global strategist, J.P. Morgan Asset Management, why he believes the markets are so far shrugging off this whole tariff threat. Let's listen.
The good news is the markets do sort of get a little desensitized to it. So it's at some stage, the market would not be doing as well as it's doing even at this stage of the year if it was as sensitive to the remarks of any previous president, or to this president as they have been to remarks by previous presidents. But I think people realize that Donald Trump is a very unusual president.
If the markets are being desensitized, do tariffs still work?
Yes and no. Look at the markets are so volatile. Today, they're desensitized because, the tariffs that the president imposed on China were so low. Canada and Mexico were able to negotiate their way out of the tariffs. And then if and when the president imposes tariffs for non-reciprocal trade, and I am certain he will, the markets will fluctuate then too, right? They go up and down daily. And so today, maybe they're calm. They think that they're calling his bluff. when he actually imposes those tariffs. There's going to be a market reaction. And then, but I really want to underscore, it smooths out again, right? It's just the sort of overreaction, and then things calm down. And once they see that the president's policies are really actively looking to offset some of the distortions in the market, they're going to be confident again. I had a lengthy discussion with the administration just today, talking about Treasury being adamant about pursuing policies that will really lessen the economic impact of the tariffs, and I'm confident that they're going to be pursuing those.
You know, we haven't talked about China at all, and I find that fascinating because that is actually a tariff that has been implemented. Another 10%. Donald Trump says it could go to 50 or 60%. What does he want to get from Beijing to keep that from happening?
You know, the grand deal, the grand bargain, right? He really wants China, the President Xi Jinping, to stop his intellectual property theft, stop the industrial subsidies that are harming U.S. countries, the industrial subsidies in China, and the list goes on. And so whether Xi Jinping is going to agree to these terms, I think it's yet to be seen. Xi Jinping's unfair, distorted economic practices, the enormous amount of subsidies he's been giving companies, has worked for him, has built China into the economic powerhouse that it is today. So yes, on one hand, the president is going to be aggressively looking for a deal. On the other hand, President Xi Jinping may say no. And so then the next question is, how much is the president willing to flex his muscles through the imposition of tariffs to get the Chinese government to bend? That we'll see. But there's very, very serious issues on the table, and I don't think either side wants to budge right now.
Nazak Nikakhtar, she's been there, former Undersecretary for the Department of Commerce in the first Trump administration. Thank you for the insights today, as always. Coming up, the Munich Security Conference underway right now with major world leaders in attendance and a focus on the war in Ukraine. This could be the early stages of a peace deal. We'll take a look at the global implications with our political panel next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino are on the way on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
Vice President J.D. Vance delivering some pretty strong words to European leaders in attendance at the Munich Security Conference now underway. The message did not land well in the room. Today on the early edition of Balance of Power, I spoke with Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council, who had a different reaction to the vice president's comments.
He is trying to provoke the Europeans into action, and he's right to do it. The Europeans have been lazy, and they have talked a big game. And here I'm pointing my finger at Germany and France in particular. You know, there's a lot of good countries like Poland and the Lithuanians and also the Nordic countries that have done a huge amount for Ukraine. But Germany and France in particular, they like to talk and they don't do. So I think he's right to point out that Ukraine is in Europe's backyard.
Joining us now, our signature political panel for their take on all this after a very busy week. Rick Davis is here, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, a Democratic analyst, political science professor at Iona University. Great to see both of you. Rick, J.D. Vance's remarks, smart politics at the start of what could be a peace deal in the works here?
You know, it's hard to tell. It's almost like he give us with one hand, right? The comments about trying to get, Europe to do more around their own defense. I think that's a totally legitimate and good message. But the idea that you leave Russia out of that communication completely, as if they have no, sort of bearing in why the Europeans need to increase their defense spending. And so I just didn't think it was a balanced speech. And then getting into the sort of domestic politics of Europe and wagging your finger saying, you're not doing enough for free speech. I hate thinking that we've got a nanny in the White House in the form of the vice president who's going to go from country to country wagging his finger at people.
Well, he said a lot today, Jeannie. It wasn't just that speech. He did an interview with the Wall Street Journal in which he threatened sanctions, new sanctions, and even military action against Russia if they did not come to a deal. Is he speaking for Donald Trump?
Yeah, you know, they should be speaking with one voice. I would hope that they are. We have heard different arguments and different positions out of this White House, certainly some that Pete Hegseth had to walk back to a certain extent. So at this point, it's hard to tell. But, you know, I have to agree with Rick on the fact I think they are right to suggest and to urge Europe that they have to invest more in their own security. But the idea that he would go over there and lecture them, you know, one of the things that really stood out is he talked a lot about the fact that they can't force people to think things and believe things. And this is the same White House that has shut the AP, the Associated Press, out of the White House because they refuse to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. It's the same White House that recently signed an EO saying that schools have to teach more patriotism. So, you know, on the one hand, he wants to lecture Europe, and on the other hand, it seems really at odds with what this White House is doing in many respects domestically here. And I think he's got to watch that. And of course, to leave Russia out of this and to suggest that what is going on in Ukraine has more to do with Europe and Ukraine than it does to do with the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. These are things that are not going to land well in Europe or certainly Ukraine.
Well, from the mixed messaging file on this very story, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, walked back some comments that he made about Ukraine earlier this week that did not agree with what J.D. Vance said earlier. Listen to the change of tune the past 2 days.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. These negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump.
Rick Davis, how is the Secretary of Defense doing, and who's he speaking for?
Well, he then walked back into the same comments in Poland today. So, I mean, depending upon, I guess there's a Brussels speech or the Poland speech. Exactly. I mean, I think, consistency would be something that I think everybody would advise him to just give one speech and take the hits. Look, obviously, this is an evolving issue. The idea that the Trump administration is weighing into this negotiation as being the top negotiator, for Ukraine-Russia settlement has got everybody sort of playing catch up to where Donald Trump is. And look, I mean, Donald Trump holds all the cards. He gets to decide at any moment what he's going to consider a negotiating tactic, and he has been all over the map. Yep. I would just like to say, Happy Valentine's Day to Jeannie. Anytime she says, I agree with Rick Davis, it's Valentine's Day. Here, there's romance in the air. Jeannie, I don't know. Donald Trump said he was going to end the war on day one. We're coming up on a month. Is this a strategy in itself?
Yeah, Rick just did that to disarm me, so I can't possibly disagree with him now. But happy Valentine's Day. It was well played, Jeannie. I'll give him that. It was a good tactic. I think we need to remember, speaking of the man at the top, what he said yesterday. Here is somebody who is blaming Joe Biden for suggesting that maybe Ukraine be allowed in at some point to NATO. And quite frankly, I don't personally believe they should be. And there's many people who, on sound reasons, disagree with that. But to suggest that that's the reason the war occurred is to forget that there was an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia in 2014 and again when the last few years. And so, this idea of Hegseth and Trump to consistently be making statements which give Russia a pass on this is really, really damaging to all of us. And by the way, makes us all less secure, because what's now to stop China from entering Taiwan? If it's like a free-for-all around the world, and if you're the strong men and you can just bounce right into a country and that's okay, that is a horrible message to be sending. And that's something Zelensky has been saying for many, many years now.
Let's hope it's not a free-for-all. Just quickly, if J.D. Vance meeting today with Vladimir Zelensky, will this in fact be hashed out between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Look, I mean, there are going to be a lot of ways to leverage this, and Zelensky's got NATO backing him. He's got Europe backing him. So that's a card he can play at any given time. Everybody's going to want to get into this if it's going to be a peaceful solution, and nobody's going to want to touch it if the war continues. It begins here, and we'll have a lot more with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, next as we take a look at the DOGE and what the next target might be. Our closers stay with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think we do need to delete entire agencies as opposed to leave part of them behind. Because if you leave part of them behind, it's easy. It's kind of like if leaving a weed. If you don't remove the roots of the weed, then it's easy for the weed to grow back. But if you remove the roots of the weed, it doesn't stop weeds from ever growing back, but it makes it harder. So we have to really delete entire agencies, many of them.
Poetic, unless you're the weed. Elon Musk on a video call to the World Governments Summit in Dubai. It's where he made the delete entire agencies remark, talking about how some government agencies indeed should just be eliminated entirely as they continue the work at DOGE. Back with us, our closers, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, our signature political panel. What do you think about that, Jeannie? Is there a button on the DOGE keyboard that says delete? Congress has no say in that?
Well, they're supposed to. And, Joe, that made me laugh because you're right. You don't want to be the weed with Elon Musk pulling like that. But, you know, Congress is supposed to have a role. They haven't taken that up yet. He's right that we can be much more efficient. Certainly the government can. And I think we all know that. The challenge here, as so many things, putting aside Elon Musk doing this, is what is efficiency? How is that measured? We haven't gotten any inkling of how that is going to work. And so just firing people or getting rid of entire committees, entire agencies, entire departments, that's not how you define efficiency. Efficiency means that you do a better job with the resources you have and you deliver services in a more efficient and a stronger and a better way. So I hope that at some point we get some markers here where there are some measurements and assessments rather than just talking about firing people and getting rid of entire departments.
The purge has begun, Rick. Thousands of workers laid off in messages delivered through pre-recorded videos and on group calls. Anyone who's ever been fired by email can relate with this. The fact of the matter is, if you're a voter who sent Donald Trump back to Washington to break it, to cut it, this is music to their ears, right?
Yeah, this is burn it down. You're going through these agencies with a wide swath, right? Mm-hmm. You're just firing everybody and then try to figure out who needs to be back at work on Monday. And, that just happened in the Department of Energy. Reports have that there was a big firing in the Department of Energy, and they sort of fired a few people, 40 or 50, who were actually taking care of our nuclear stockpile. Wow. And it was like, hey, you guys got to get back in here.
Yeah, okay.
And so, look, Jeannie's right. Government is inefficient. And every government, every president that I can recall, Republican and Democratic alike, have tried to fix government. Mm-hmm. And none of them have done a particularly good job. And so here we've got someone who literally is burning it down. And look, I agree that we're missing some opportunities here to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, something is finally happening on this. And if we can then piece back together some of these programs in a more efficient fashion, then I'd say it's probably been worth it.
Jeannie, is it possible to put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
Oh, I hope so. I think the challenge here for the Trump administration is overreading this mandate, because I am not sure that the vast majority of the supporters and the voters in 24 wanted things slashed. I think they wanted the government more efficient, more effective. Joe Biden used to talk about doing a better job delivering for the people. And that is certainly true. But that is very different from cutting and slashing and breaking. And so can they put it back together is going to be a big question, because you slash what people need and they're going to feel it at the ballot box.
Conversation to be continued with Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our signature panel. Happy Friday. Thanks to you both. We'll see you back here next week. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter in the meantime. You can find it on the terminal and online. Thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power. Have a great weekend. I hope it's a long one for you. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.